tech lab, as you see here in the slide. She's going to tell us about algorithmic risk assessment in the hands of humans today. Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So let's see. So I'm going to talk today about risk assessments and their use in the criminal justice system, specifically in criminal sentencing. The paper I'm going to be talking about is joint work with Megan Stevenson, who is now at UVA Law. She just moved. I need to change that title slide. And she's an economist as well. So the main motivation for economists like us being interested in this, and for a lot of research and policy interest in risk assessments, is that sentencing decisions in the criminal justice system are at least in part predictions. So when a judge is considering how long to sentence someone for, they are thinking about a lot of things, but one of the things they're thinking about is what's the likelihood that that person will reoffend in the future. And so there's this general sense that all else equal, those who are a greater threat to society should be incarcerated for longer. Part of the benefit of locking someone up is that they can't go on to commit more crime while they're in prison. The potential problem is that judges are human beings. And so like all human beings, they might not be that great at predicting risk. And so there's been a lot of interest, both in the research space and the policy space, in whether algorithmic risk scores, which summarize all the data relevant to risk in a standardized way, could improve decision-making. And by this, I mean they might enable courts to target incarceration more efficiently and fairly across defendants. But there's also a lot of concern that these tools could simply exacerbate biases in the criminal justice system by reducing room for the beneficial discretion of the judge, who, you know, is a wise person who could potentially see a lot of things that the data or the computer can't see. So these types of tools are increasingly popular, but very controversial. We often see big headlines in the media about how biased these things are, or how they could, you know, solve all our problems or create much worse problems. And there really isn't any current real world effects or evidence on what the effects of these types of tools will be. So we use data from Virginia to examine this issue. And the main question we're interested in as researchers is what were the effects of the implementation of risk assessments in sentencing on the distribution of sentences and on recidivism. And to give you a sense of where I'm heading here, basically what we find is that the judges do respond to the risk assessment tool. So, you know, they have a lot of information in front of them that they can consider when they're making a sentencing decision. But we do find that, you know, when they are comparing people just on either side of a threshold, where, you know, those who are, you know, they're very similar people, but the risk assessment is giving one person a very different recommendation than the other, the judges do respond to that recommendation. So that implies to us that they're, you know, looking at that piece of paper and considering the recommendation of the risk score. So the judges are paying attention to this, which is good news, but that's really the end of the good news. So there are two different types of risk assessments that we consider here. One is a risk assessment for nonviolent offenders. It was implemented with the specific policy goal of reducing incarceration for that group by 25%. We find it had no impact on incarceration, right? So it did not do what the legislature intended it to do. There was also a sex offender risk assessment. It was implemented with the specific policy goal of increasing incarceration for that group. It instead reduced incarceration for convicted sex offenders. Again, not what the legislature intended. There was no improvement in public safety. So even though, you know, the judges were paying attention to this and locking up some people that were higher risk and not locking up some people that were lower risk, it didn't change recidivism rates in any way. So there weren't any of what we would call efficiency gains in the allocation of incarceration. So that's not good news. One thing that so then we consider the distribution of sentences. So who's getting locked up now that wasn't getting locked up before? And the big takeaway at that point is that there's a big increase in sentencing for young people relative to older defendants. And so this group is high risk. One of the best predictors of going on to commit more crime is age. Young people do a lot of dumb stuff, including committing criminal offenses. But young people are typically viewed as less culpable for their crimes and typically receive leniency due to youth. We know that people's brains aren't fully developed until they're in their mid-20s. And so judges typically take that into consideration and give young people a second chance. But that goes directly against what the risk score is recommending, because it's totally focused on risk. So that's one big takeaway from the paper. A lot of people really worry about racial disparities in these tools. We find that there's no impact of using these risk assessments on racial disparities in Virginia statewide. We do find some suggestive evidence that racial disparities widened in circuits where the judges responded most to the risk assessment tool. So where their behavior, with the judges that seem to pay the most attention to these risk assessments. So, that's a red flag on an important issue, but overall, we don't find super robust evidence that racial disparities are increasing or decreasing. And so in some ways that could be good news for those who are really worried about the impacts of these tools. It's certainly bad news for people like me who had really hoped that these tools could actually reduce racial disparities. And so overall, what seems to be happening here is that the lack of benefits from these tools in the real world appears to be due to judges' reluctance to follow the risk score recommendations to incarcerate even more young people than they do when they respond as much as they do here. And so, I think there are some really important implications here for criminal justice reform and just how hard it is to get people, to the various actors in the criminal justice system, to change their behavior in the way that we want them to, and to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And so that is something that I view as really one of the main takeaways from this paper. So let me tell you a little bit more about risk assessments, how they're created, how they're used. The basic goal of risk assessment algorithms in the criminal justice system is to predict future crime. In practice, that's defined as a rearrest or reconviction within some time period going forward. In Virginia, for the nonviolent offenders we're going to be studying, this means another conviction for a felony offense within 3 years. So it has to be defined in that way. People often imagine these risk assessment algorithms are created using fancy machine learning techniques. Sometimes they are, and they could be, and there's a lot of research going into doing that. But in practice, in most places, it's just a simple regression. There's a bunch of data that we have on past defendants, and someone uses that data to run a regression and figure out which of those variables are correlated with a future reoffense, either a rearrest or reconviction. And so those predictive factors could include a whole bunch of stuff. Sometimes people know what it is, and sometimes they don't. In Virginia, it was public information, so we do know in this context, and I'll show you that a little bit later on. The predictive factors can include things like the person's criminal history, some demographic information, some socioeconomic factors. Those can be somewhat controversial. In general, these can include gender, but they can't include race for constitutional reasons. And so, someone, when they're building one of these risk assessments, runs the regression and then takes those regression coefficients and converts them into integer weights, and basically creates a worksheet or checklist. So you get so many points if you're under age 25. You get more points if you're male. You get more points if you have past felony convictions, and so on. You basically add those up and you get your risk score. And then people are divided into groups based on that score. So you might have people who are labeled low risk or moderate risk or high risk. And those different risk labels are typically paired with some explicit action recommendation. So in this context, we have that low risk defendants are recommended for diversion from incarceration. So they're recommended for release or probation. And in practice, these are always used to supplement decision-making. A lot of policy simulations implicitly assume that the machine is replacing the judge, right? So you often hear data scientists and computer scientists talking about these algorithms and really trying to get the algorithm right, almost assuming that the algorithm itself is going to be the final answer, but that's never in practice the way that these things are used. They're always just one more piece of information that's given to the judge before they make their decision. But the judge is always the one who makes the final call. So there's been huge growth in their use over the last decade. At this point, risk assessments are used at almost every stage of the criminal justice system. They help determine pretrial custody, so during that bail decision, sentencing, which is what we're considering today, probation supervision, prison placement, parole. Currently 35 states use risk assessment in sentencing in at least some counties. So this is extremely popular. And we can think of risk assessment as having 3 different goals. One is efficiency. So that goal is basically to lower incarceration rates with minimal effect on public safety, or vice versa, right? To improve public safety by basically incarcerating the right people. So making better use of incarceration. We can also think of risk assessment as potentially providing greater consistency. So we know that there's a lot of variation across different judges. Judges have, a lot of personal preferences in terms of how much to use incarceration. And so, that can seem really unfair when we think about, you happen to be randomly assigned to this person's courtroom instead of this person's courtroom. And that individual judge's preferences can determine how long you're locked up. I think there's a general sense that the same type of person, the same, 2 similar people with similar charges should have similar outcomes. And so risk assessment, to the extent that it standardizes the outcomes across defendants or across courtrooms, could help improve fairness in that way and reduce that idiosyncrasy. This might also include reducing racial disparities. And then the last goal of risk assessment that we have in mind here is control. So there is some hope, and this was certainly the case in Virginia in this particular policy experiment, that you could sort of centralize decision-making and implement policy goals. So these legislatures, were aiming to produce particular policy goals when they implemented risk assessment in the state. They wanted to reduce incarceration for nonviolent offenders and increase incarceration for sex offenders. And so they were really hoping to clarify for judges who should be incarcerated and who shouldn't. That was part of the goal here. As I mentioned in that previous slide, that those goals were not achieved, but that was certainly the intention of using these risk assessments. So not leaving it entirely up to the individual judge, but to provide some guidance from whoever created the risk assessment about what they're supposed to do. Of course, intentions don't always match real world effects. This is a common theme in a lot of economics research and policy research. And there are really strong priors on both sides about what the effects of risk assessment will have in practice. And so, so it's a really important empirical question that I think we need some research to answer. And so I thought I'd step through the arguments both for and against risk assessment, just to start to think through how these things might affect behavior and what some of the big picture both potential and concerns about these algorithms could be. So the main reason that people hope that these algorithms could be effective and can move us in the right direction is that there's a sense that predictions based only on relevant information in a standardized way across all people could be more accurate and fair. So these risk assessments, because they use the same data for everyone, and it's just the data that someone has determined is relevant to someone's risk of reoffense, it's going to remove biases due to irrelevant stuff like the time of day, whether your football team lost that weekend, whether you're hungry, and whether that person standing in front of you is Black or white. And there's plenty of research showing that humans are easily, and judges in particular, are easily distracted by irrelevant information like this. And so in this case, the relevant information isn't the question that's typically asked in the media about algorithms. That is the algorithm biased? The important question is the algorithm less biased than the judge? And if the answer to that is yes, then this could be moving us in the right direction, even if it doesn't completely solve the problem. And indeed, there have been some policy simulations that show really large gains for models where machines replace judges. So there's a paper by Kleinberg and colleagues that I think of as the most careful version of this. They essentially compare defendants, similar defendants who were randomly assigned to judges with different propensities to detain people pre-trial. So that's that bail decision. And essentially what they find is that if they replace the judge's decisions with the risk assessment recommendation, they could reduce pretrial detention by 42% without changing the crime rate, or they could reduce crime by 25% with no change in the detention rate. And so in other words, what the punchline of that paper is that these judges are routinely making mistakes about who to lock up. They're getting it, and the authors really conclude that the judges are just getting it wrong. They're getting distracted by irrelevant information, and they're locking up some low-risk people when they should be locking up more high-risk people. And so their conclusion is that these risk assessments can correct those mistakes and help the judges lock the right people up. And then the third reason that these risk assessments could be really helpful is that they could give judges political cover to release people that they already know are low risk. And so the risk assessments in this case might not provide new information, but essentially provides a second opinion that makes them feel more comfortable following through on what they know is the right course of action anyway. We heard this from judges a lot when we talked to them as part of when we were working on this project. And so, the idea here is that the judges often are worried about their own jobs. They're worried about being reelected or reappointed. And if they let someone out, even if they know the person's really low risk and deserves a second chance, if that person goes on to reoffend, they could be held accountable. And so that really pushes a strong bias then toward locking more people up. Because if they make a mistake in the other direction and lock people up who never would have reoffended, no one's going to notice that, right? And they're never going to be held accountable for that. And so now if they have this piece of paper saying the person's low risk, then if the person goes on to reoffend, they can kind of point to that piece of paper as proof that they weren't being careless or negligent in some way. And so what are the possible problems with these risk assessments? What are people worried about? The main thing is that these algorithms are trained on existing data, and the goal is to identify patterns in past behavior in order to predict the future. And so this means that any problematic patterns from the past, whether it's racism or sexism or economic disadvantage, might be reproduced and reinforced, but now with the veneer of science. So now it's not the human judge that's locking up the Black defendant more often, it's the computer that's saying the Black defendant is higher risk. And that could somehow be a harder problem to correct. And so, a really basic example of the type of problem we have in mind here is if Black men are more likely to be convicted of new crimes than white men who commit the same offense due to biases in arrests or conviction and jury decisions and so on, then the algorithm is going to predict accurately that Black men are higher risk. They're more likely to be convicted again in the future. Now, that doesn't mean they're more likely to actually offend again in the future, but they're more likely to show up in the data again in the future because of biases in our criminal justice system. And so that's something that's just, extraordinarily difficult to remove from these data sets. There are lots of smart people who are thinking about how to improve the accuracy of these algorithms and, find ways to reduce biases in them. But this is just a fundamental problem that is going to be very difficult to overcome. Oops. Another problem with these algorithms is that they're trained on post-treatment outcome data. So this is for the data folks in the crowd. And so the basic idea here is that we're only going to observe new offenses if people aren't incarcerated. And so the way these things actually work is that we take data for a population that was released from prison in the past. So they're convicted and they weren't not released, but if they were convicted and did not go to prison in the first place, so they were diverted before, we run the regression on those people, and then we apply the results out of sample to try to predict who among those who weren't released would be relatively low risk and should have been released. And so whenever we try to extrapolate results like that out of sample, we should be a little bit cautious and we should be a little worried that it might not apply in the way that we hope it will to this alternate sample. And so it might actually be that these risk scores aren't that accurate, and they might actually be less accurate than the judges are. And then the third reason to worry about these risk assessments is basically the flip side of the third bullet from the previous slide. They could impose political pressure that limits mercy and leniency for high-risk defendants. So now you have someone standing before you. We're particularly worried about young people here. That was just doing something, stupid because they're young and they're going to grow out of this. But now you have a piece of paper saying this person's high risk. And so if they go on to commit another crime, now the public really could blame you for it because you went against this risk assessment recommendation saying that they should be locked up. And so this really highlights the idea that risk does not imply culpability. These are kind of fundamentally different concepts in the legal system. And these risk scores are really only aimed at predicting the first one. And then, of course, we could just expect null effects, right? We could expect maybe these risk assessments just don't do anything at all. Maybe the judges just ignore them. So there's a great survey by 2 law professors in Virginia where they asked judges to talk about, whether they use risk assessments, and if so, why, and how they think about these things. And one very memorable judge wrote that, he does not use risk assessments, he won't pay attention to risk assessments, and he also doesn't go to psychics. Thank you very much. And so this really drives home that there's going to be maybe some people who just think this stuff is complete hogwash, and they're not interested in using it because they feel like they know what they're doing. They're professionals. So some of you might remember a big ProPublica article from several years ago. This is what got Megan and I actually onto this path and working on this paper. It raised a lot of awareness about potential bias in these algorithms, but there were a lot of problems with this analysis. And I think going through what the problems are helped to build the case for the kind of analysis that we're going to do in this paper. So, and we wrote a post for Brookings about this when this first came out. So if you're interested in more, you can look that up. So the first problem is just, the article basically went through comparing white and black defendants. I believe this is during pretrial detention, people who, maybe it was sentencing, I'm forgetting, both of them are relevant here, but white and black defendants. And they looked at those that the risk assessment labeled high risk, but did not reoffend. And you can see that, white defendants are less likely to be labeled high risk, but not reoffending than the black defendants. And then they also looked at people who were labeled low risk, but did go on to reoffend. They're looking at when the algorithm got it wrong. So this analysis is really focusing on false positive rates. So when it said that the person would reoffend, but they got it wrong, it turns out that metric is just mechanically higher for groups that are more likely to reoffend. And so you can kind of convince yourself of this in Excel after the seminar, after this webinar, if you're interested. It took me a little bit. It's not a super intuitive result, but it is true. And so it turns out that that false positive rate just is not very interesting and not a good way of thinking about this. Another problem is that, this goes back to the kind of post-treatment data issue that I was talking about earlier. The analysis uses data based on what happened after people were treated in some way. So they're labeled high risk, but then the judge did something with that information. And so if you're labeled high risk, you're probably going to get locked up for some period of time. And we're not going to see what happens to you until after you're released. And while you're locked up, you're probably not able to commit more crime. And so the labels that you're high risk but didn't reoffend should actually read labeled high risk and so was incarcerated and didn't reoffend, right? And so reoffense rates here could actually say more about who was incarcerated than the risk level at the time of sentencing. And this really drives home that knowing what the true risk level of someone was at the time that they're being sentenced is really difficult. It seems like a straightforward thing to know, but given our current system and that people are being locked up, we're not just operating in a vacuum where we get a risk score and then immediately know the truth. It's actually really difficult to see this information in the data, and it might be impossible. And then the third problem here is that the risk scores don't determine the treatment, the judges do. And so this interaction between the machine and the human is really key here. And that's what, is part of the reason that Megan and I went down this road and wrote this paper. So it could be that the risk scores themselves are unbiased, but the judges were biased. They might be more likely to give high risk white defendants a break, and they might be more likely to lock up low risk black defendants. And since incarceration has an incapacitation effect, that is, while you're locked up, you can't commit more crime, locking someone up mechanically reduces the reoffending rate. And so that could produce the pattern seen above. So it might have nothing to do with the algorithm itself, and it might have everything to do with the way the human being, the judge, is applying that algorithm. And so what we really want to know here is what happens when these algorithms are introduced in the real world. We can't know what the real world effects are going to be just by looking at the algorithm itself and the data it produces. And so the policy question here is, what's the effect of actually using the risk scores? This is a policy intervention like any other. Lots of people are focused on the prediction piece, but we'd argue that's really not what matters in the end. What matters is the net impact of using the predictions in some way on the outcomes we care about. So does this tool, when we actually implement it, reduce incarceration rates, reduce recidivism, or reduce racial disparities? If this policy doesn't achieve its intended goals, it could be that part of the reasons the risk scores weren't very good, and we'll consider that in this paper, but there might be a lot of other reasons too. And what's really important here is we need to understand how the machine and the human are interacting. How are humans actually using this information in the context of the incentives they have, the other information they have, and the judges and the prosecutors' goals or objectives are going to be really key factors in determining those real world effects. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about Virginia now. Virginia was one of the first states to use risk assessments in sentencing. There was a Truth in Sentencing Reform Bill in the mid-90s. This was a reform that happened in a lot of states that basically meant that people were going to serve a larger share of their sentence. So instead of getting out early on good behavior, people are going to be spending more time in prison. So people knew that this was going to increase jail and prison populations and started worrying about that. And a nonviolent risk assessment was proposed as essentially a release valve. The hope was to identify some relatively low risk offenders to release from prison and make room for these growing prison populations. There was also a sex offender risk assessment that was developed in parallel, but adopted separately. There was a year in between them, which gives us some traction to separate their effects. A little more context on Virginia for those who know about this stuff. Virginia uses voluntary sentencing guidelines. And so this means there's a range for someone with a particular criminal history and for a particular set of charges. There's a range of recommended sentences for that person. You can think of these risk assessments as effectively amending the guidelines recommended sentence for the affected defendants. And so it essentially extends the guidelines recommended sentence range to 0 for those who are recommended for diversion, the nonviolent offenders, and for the sex offenders, it extends the range upward. So there's a higher range of sentences that are recommended under these rules. Plea negotiation is common here. So whenever I say judge, you should interpret that as meaning basically the court, and that includes the prosecutors. So prosecutors are influential in sentencing. The key here is that everyone has all of the same information at the time of the plea bargain. So it's essentially, the risk assessment is basically a worksheet that both the prosecutor and defense attorney can fill out and know what the person's risk score is going to be going into that plea negotiation. So it's not necessarily the judge making the decision, although they have final sign off on any of the plea bargains that are actually agreed upon. Now, as I mentioned, these risk assessments were adopted with specific policy goals in Virginia. So the nonviolent risk assessment was designed with the aim of decreasing incarceration rates. The goal was to identify the 25% lowest risk nonviolent offenders for diversion from incarceration. It was used solely for people convicted of drug, larceny, and fraud offenses. And you're ineligible if one of two things was true. One, if the guidelines recommended sentence was probation. So if you weren't going to be locked up in the first place, then you're not eligible for the risk assessment. And the other reason you could be ineligible is if you have a prior or current violent conviction. They're really targeting nonviolent offenders here. The other risk assessment was for sex offenders. It was designed to lengthen sentences for those at the highest risk of a violent reoffense. It was only for people convicted of sexual assault and rape. It turns out there was a simultaneous change in the sentencing guidelines for people convicted of sexual assault. So for a bunch of our analysis, we're only going to focus on the rape offenders. But otherwise, a lot of the same stuff kind of goes through. And you'll see when I distinguish between sex offenses and rape offenses going forward. Other than that, there was no risk assessment for anyone else. So if you're a defendant convicted of assault or robbery or burglary or DUI, anything but these few offenses listed here, you would not have a risk assessment done. And those are going to basically serve as our comparison group. So here's a list of the actual factors that went into the risk assessment for the nonviolent offenders. It's a bunch of stuff on their criminal history, their gender, their age. There were two of these socioeconomic factors, which are pretty controversial, and actually have since been removed. It turns out they didn't matter a whole lot, didn't provide a lot of predictive power, but those are employment status and marital status. And the reason they're controversial is because they might predict future risk, but they're not something that provides culpability or something like that, and certainly could be correlated with race and are also potentially correlated with poverty. So a lot of people worry this is essentially just criminalizing poverty. And then this risk assessment was trained to predict a new felony conviction within 3 years. So that's the outcome that the Sentencing Commission was focused on when they designed this. The sex offender risk assessment is really different. It considers things like their relationship with the victim, the location of the offense, whether the person had the mental health or substance abuse history, and so lots of different factors here. This is kind of a very different type of crime in many ways. And the goal here was to predict a new sex offense or crime against a person, so any violent offense, within 5 years. That was the outcome that the initial risk assessment was trying to predict. Here's a timeline of the rollout here. So we've got the Truth in Sentencing Reform. It turned out there was a nonviolent risk assessment pilot in the late 90s, but then the risk assessments were adopted statewide in the early 2000s. And that's the period we're going to be focusing on. Our data come from two sources. One is the Virginia Criminal Sentencing Commission. It gives us all felony convictions from 1995 through 2017. And this includes information on the risk assessments plus some input variables, the sentencing guideline recommendations plus input variables, and some basic case details. Importantly, and at least in Virginia, the Sentencing Commission does not track the gender or race of the defendant. So we had to get that separately. It turns out all Virginia court records are online, and there was an enterprising data scientist who was working on scraping those. And so he scraping them and putting them online. And so we got those data from him, and we're able to match them to our Sentencing Commission data with a pretty good match rate, at least from year 2000 on. And that gives us the gender and race of the defendant. Okay, so here's what we actually did and what we found. So first, what we wanted to look at was just, is there any indication here that the judges are actually paying attention to these risk scores? And so the way that we did this is, you have someone with risk scores, say from like 1 to 20, and so there's going to be it's a continuous variable, but then at particular cutoffs, someone is labeled low risk or moderate risk and high risk. So the low risk cutoff was what really mattered here, and anyone who is just below that threshold would have their risk score, the information the judge would get, it would say that they're low risk, and there would be a box that's checked saying they're recommended for diversion. And so if the judge really wanted, they could find the actual score in the paperwork too, but that was the most salient piece, was this checkbox was checked saying you're recommended for diversion. For the sex offenders, it was a checkbox was checked if you're recommended for a higher sentence. And so basically what we wanted to know is, for very similar defendants, those just on either side of the threshold, did the judges notice and pay attention to and respond to the fact that the checkbox was checked? And it turns out the answer is yes. They did respond to whether that checkbox was checked. So here, what we're looking at is the risk score is on the x-axis, and so it's going to just be a continuous measure, and the people who are just on either side of that 0, which is our recentered threshold, are very similar defendants. Nothing else is changing at that threshold, except that these people on the just below have the checkbox checked, and the people just above do not. And what we find is there's a big jump in the probability that the people that you're locked up, if you are just over that low risk threshold and don't have the checkbox checked, And there's also a big jump in the length of your sentence. So the judges do change sentencing for nonviolent offenders, and you're less likely to be locked up if you're recommended for diversion by the risk assessment. We see something very similar with the sex offenders. If you're just over the high risk threshold in this case, you're much more likely to be locked up, and you're going to have a longer sentence. So the judges are paying attention to this. So that's good news, right? They're responding to this additional piece of paper that's provided to them. But then we get into whether they actually use this information in the way the legislature intended, and whether the results are what people had hoped for. So what we look for now is whether the risk assessments actually affected net incarceration and sentence rates in the intended way. So what we're going to do here is compare the eligible and ineligible defendants before and after the policy change. So here we've got kind of, this is going to be the difference between the people who got the risk assessments and those who didn't, our comparison group. And what we're going to look for is a differential change after the risk assessment went into effect, which is when this red line. So if everything went the way it should have, we should see something pretty flat beforehand, which is what we see. And then we should see a big drop in the probability of incarceration for the eligible nonviolent offenders relative to everyone else. We don't see that. We see basically it's flat through the threshold. We don't see any effect on sentencing. And basically we see the same thing for the length of sentence. Now for rape offenders, we see something different. This looks, reasonably flat. There's some year-on-year noise. And it actually looks like incarceration falls for the rape offenders relative to everybody else. What should have happened, what the legislature wanted, was an increase. So it should have gone up, and it definitely did not go up. So what we find is basically that the risk assessment reduced the likelihood of incarceration by 5 percentage points, about 5% for rape offenders. And we think this is consistent with the idea that that the risk score for the lower risk sex offenders essentially shielded the judges from political risk of releasing those people. And so instead of pushing them to lock up the higher risk rape offenders, it actually gave them political cover to release the lower risk rape offenders, which might be fine, but is not what the legislature wanted. All right, so even though in the nonviolent offender case, people are being shuffled around, we know the judges are locking up different people because they responded to the recommendation of diversion. They're locking up, they're not locking up some people just below the threshold, but they're locking up people over the threshold. What seems to be happening, though, is that they respond to the absence of that recommendation and just shuffle people around. They're just locking up different people, not fewer people. So this could still mean we have greater efficiency, right? So maybe this is helping us target incarceration at higher risk people, even if it's not reducing net incarceration rates. So what we can do here is basically the same type of analysis we did before, but looking at recidivism as the outcome. And so if we were to find, if there are efficiency gains and a reduction in recidivism, what we should see is, again, pretty flat before the policy change. And then we should see recidivism fall relative to the comparison group. And that's not what we find. We see it's just pretty darn flat through the threshold. So there's no benefit here. If anything, I think the sign on these coefficients is positive, but there's basically there's no sign that there's a reduction in recidivism. And then what about disparities, right? This is the thing everybody worries about is, what happens to Black defendants relative to white defendants? And then we add on here our worry about what happens to young defendants relative to older defendants. And let me talk through, why we might think that there could be disparities that could widen here. So these graphs are showing you on the x-axis what the guidelines recommended sentence is. So for each quintile of the guidelines recommended sentence, what the probability of being labeled low risk is. That's on the y-axis. And what we see here is that for every guidelines recommended sentence, white defendants are more likely to be labeled low risk than Black defendants are. And on the right-hand side, older defendants are more likely to be labeled low risk than younger defendants are, again, for any individual guidelines recommended sentence. And that guidelines recommended sentence is just a function of what your criminal history is and what your current charge is. Now, the age disparities maybe are not surprising because age is a direct input into the risk assessment. Race is not a direct input, but there are some variables that are correlated with race, and so that's what people worry about here. Now, does this mean that the risk assessments are definitely going to increase disparities in sentencing? Not necessarily. So it really depends on what the judge's beliefs were about the reoffending rates of Black and white defendants and white and older defendants. And we know from previous research, I have previous work on ban the box policies that's directly in line with this type of argument. We know that eliminating information does not necessarily help the disadvantaged group. So in this case, it might have been that without the risk scores, judges might have assumed the worst about the Black and young defendants standing in front of them. And then when you give them risk scores saying that some of those people are low risk, those people are now better off, right? So it actually could improve outcomes for those groups by providing that information. What we find though is basically nothing happened to Black defendants. This is again looking at pre versus post, eligible versus ineligible, but now layering on comparison with white defendants. So looking for a differential effect for Black defendants versus white defendants. And basically there's nothing happening here. There's no differential change for Black defendants relative to white defendants. So the way I interpret this is essentially the risk score is doing just as well or just as badly as judges were doing without that information. It's not changing anything at all. Where we do see an effect though is a differential increase in sentencing for younger defendants. And young here is defined in criminal justice terms, so it's for ages, those under age 23, so very young, young adults. And this is the group that again would be in general viewed as less culpable for their crimes, and so where there's a real tendency to be lenient toward this group in sentencing. But now that we've got this risk score saying the person's high risk, it does seem to push judges to incarcerate more young people. Now we do a whole bunch in this research to talk about why the effects are so disappointing. And so we consider whether judges maybe just don't use the risk scores enough, right? For some reason, it'll take them a while to learn about them. What if we just focus on the judges whose behavior changed the most, because we know there's a lot of variation across judges. Turns out none of these really explain anything. Even if we look at just at the judges who really use these things the most, our results are basically entirely the same. The one thing that's different is it does look like there's a slight increase in racial disparities for those judges. But otherwise, all the other results are the same. It's not increasing efficiency. It's not reducing incarceration rates, none of that. And then we think about other potential reasons that this might have gone astray in some way. And so I'm not going to talk through all of these, but one is just that maybe the risk assessment tool isn't very good. So maybe we could build a better, fancier one with machine learning. Turns out we can't. Our machine learning version is, slightly better than Virginia's very simple regression, but really not much. With the data available, their risk score is pretty darn good. But the answer here seems to be that when we look at when judges are deviating from the risk score recommendation. So when are they paying attention to the recommendation that's on the piece of paper, and when do they ignore it? And it turns out they systematically pay attention to the risk score in different ways for some people than others. And the big factor here seems to be that they are more likely to show mercy and be lenient toward what you might think of as more sympathetic defendants. So judges are systematically deviating from the risk score in order to be lenient toward defendants that are white, that are young, and that are women. And all of those things have implications for fairness. All of those things mean that the risk scores are not being implemented in a fair and consistent way across defendants, and we should be worried about that. But the leniency toward young people is particularly important because that's the high risk group, right? So if the whole point of these risk scores is to push judges to lock up more high risk people and let out lower risk people, then basically almost all of the efficiency gains were going to come from locking young people up. And the judges don't want to do that for probably good reason, right? They're good reasons that we have this tendency to let younger people out. And so let me just show you, we can run a simulation, but what would have happened if if the machine had replaced the judge, right? In the way that those other policy simulations had done and that suggested big efficiency gains. And so this is the graph I showed you before about what happened to racial disparities. Nothing happened in practice. This is what would have happened if the machine had replaced the judge, if the judge had just had to do whatever the risk score said. Actually, it looks like racial disparities would have increased slightly. Not a lot, but slightly. This is the graph that I showed you before for age disparities, where we did see an increase in age disparities, and that looked pretty big to us relative to all the other the non-changes we've seen in other results. But this is what would have happened if the judges had to do what the risk score said. Those incarceration rates for young people would have skyrocketed. And so basically what we're seeing here is that the judges just ignored the risk score recommendation for a lot of these young people and locked up some more than they did before. So there was a big increase in incarceration for young people, but it's nowhere near as it would have been, as big as it would have been if the judges hadn't had that discretion. And so basically what we find here is that, at least in Virginia, risk assessment did affect judicial decision-making. They paid attention to those scores, but it did not affect net incarceration rates or sentences in the way the legislature intended. It did not improve efficiency. It did increase incarceration for young defendants relative to older defendants. It did not affect racial disparities statewide, although we do see some evidence of increased racial disparities in the most responsive circuits. And the punchline here is that the judges are systematically deviating from the high-risk recommendations for what they might consider sympathetic defendants, those who are white, those who are young, and those who are women. And youth is particularly important here because it's a strong predictor of recidivism, but there are established norms of leniency toward young defendants due to lower perceived culpability. And so what this all means is that there are other objectives that judges are thinking about, which might be obvious, right? In many ways, there are other things judges are thinking about, particularly a desire to show mercy toward young people, and that could limit the efficiency gains of these risk scores when they're implemented in the real world. So I think another real takeaway from this is that, all those policy simulations had shown, and the authors had concluded from them, that judges were routinely making mistakes in who to lock up. And what our results suggest to us is that it's not clear that the judges are making mistakes. It might just be that they have different goals in mind, right? So it's not that they need the risk score to correct them. They might know this young person's high risk, but there's a reason they're going to give them a second chance. And so this means that the potential benefits of these risk scores in the criminal justice context might be very limited. If the judges aren't making mistakes that routinely, there's going to be a much lower potential here to see big benefits from providing these predictions. And so, as in many policy areas, if this has implications for criminal justice reform, if we really want to change the behavior of people on the ground, and this is something obviously the legislatures in Virginia wanted to do. They were trying to implement this policy with specific policy goals in mind, and they failed, right? And part of the reason they failed is they didn't understand the objectives of the people whose behavior they were trying to change. And so what we need to be doing going forward is try to understand what the objectives of judges and prosecutors are if we want to change their behavior. And I think that's all I've got for you. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. If you are on the attendee list here, if you want to raise your hand to ask questions, I can let you talk. Group is small enough that I should be able to go through it here. As people, oh, there we go. Go ahead. Let me see here. Did you get I'm asking to unmute here the person, raise your hand. Huh. Hello?
Hello?
Oh, hi, there we go.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer, great presentation. The question I had really revolves around Malcolm Gladwell. I'm sure you've read his book, Talking to Strangers. In that book, he discusses a study that was done by a Harvard economist in conjunction with I think a Chicago University bail expert. And in that experiment, or in that research, they looked at 555,000 defendants in New York. and they looked at what human judges had done in terms of releasing those defendants. 72% of them, or 400,000, were released by the judges. So then, working with some computer experts, they put together their own algorithm and said, hey, computer, give us 400,000 people that you would release. And son of a gun, 25% lower incident of crimes committed by those people who the computer predicted while they were out on bail awaiting trial than what the human judges predicted. Additionally, the computer picked 1% that they said should never be released, people the computer considered high risk. And it turned out that the human judges had released 50% of those people on bail. The judges had kind of three pools of data, your rap sheet, DA testimony and the defendant testimony, and then their own eyes. And the computer only had, your age and your rap sheet. And so Gladwell's, kind of question is, how is it that meeting a stranger can sometimes make us worse at making sense of that person than not meeting them at all? And I'm just wondering, as you look at Virginia, is that the only place to look, or is there evidence that algorithms and machine learning actually can do better than humans at making these decisions? Symphonies do a lot better at picking a next violin player when they do it behind a screen and aren't looking at whether the person's white, black, fat, ugly, handsome, whatever. And so I'm just wondering if it works for symphonies, why couldn't it over time work for granting bail?
Yeah, so you just outlined, a lot of the reasons that I talked about for, why there's so much promise to these things, right? And I certainly put myself in the camp of people that has been very optimistic about the potential of risk scores to improve decision making and reduce biases. The type of experiment you're talking about is one of those policy simulations that suggests that judges are routinely making mistakes and saying, like, look at all these obviously high risk people that they didn't lock up, and look at all these obviously low risk people that they did lock up. But then the question is, what, were they actually mistakes? So the judge might have known this, and in that particular case, as here, my hunch is that a lot of the high risk people that they didn't lock up were young people. And so, it might not have been a mistake. It might have been an intentional decision by the judge not to lock the young person up. And then, just in general, we're going to need to understand what happens when we implement these risk scores. Judges aren't necessarily just going to do whatever the computer wants them to do. They're going to implement them in a way that might be filtered through their own biases and make things worse. So I think I'd put that in the category of one of the policy simulations that suggested these things had big promise. But ours is the first study that looks at what happens in the sentencing context in the real world. There have been a couple of studies that look at what happens in the pretrial detention scenario in the real world, and they don't find any benefits either. And so the punchline so far seems to be, I think the burden of proof is shifting back toward all the data scientists and computer scientists to figure out how to implement these things in a way that actually produces some of the benefits that they're hoping for. But so far, those benefits aren't being borne out in the real world, which is super disappointing to people like me.
All right, Jennifer, there's a question here in the chat. Let me see if I ask it. In the age analysis, did you distinguish the race of young people? How do the results look if you break down by race? So I think they're referring to the plot you show an increase on the age. If they were to follow the algorithm, you would see an increase of incarceration of the young people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of the breakdown? I guess you're showing us a coefficient. They're in a multiple regression, correct or not?
We're showing that graph was basically looking at tracing it over time. So I think what they're asking for is an interaction between age and race, is the way that I'm interpreting that question. We have not done that. That is something that's been on our to-do list. A couple of people have asked us about that recently, and basically, my hunch is that this is that the effect would be especially large for, say, young Black men. I think it would be interesting to sort of interact and see how judges are maybe responding differently or implementing the risk score and risk recommendation differently across, say, like young Black men, young Black women, young white men, young white women, rather than just looking at white versus Black and young versus old. But we haven't done that yet, so I'll have to put that on the to-do list.
But do you have a sense of the correlation between young and Black, for example, in your sample there?
Not off the top of my head. I used to have a table in here that looked at that suggested what one of those correlations was, but I am not remembering what it was. So sorry.
Okay, so going back to the same set of plots there. If I'm understanding correctly, when I look across time, let's say for go back to the slide we have. You have no, the one before, of race, the one with race. There we go. Right. So on the panel on the left, showing us that pre or post the use of the risk assessment, we don't see any difference between the way Black defendants are treated. Right. So the availability
relative to the comparison group.
Relative to the comparison group, exactly. So there's no change in, so they might still be treated in different ways, but it's no different in the after the implementation of the tool. If the tool were to be implemented, if the judges were to follow the tool, actually, because again, most likely because of the biases in the data, you would expect an increase here, right, on the incarceration rate. But again, what you would see even would be very, very small. So what I'm surprised by here is the fact that when you contrast that to the next slide, I mean, the changes are enormous here now, relatively. So I'm just trying to sort of like, the story of the biases that judges have, right? It seems that the bias towards young people, pro-young people, is overwhelming relative to anything else that they might be putting in place. So in some ways, understanding this issue here might be the most important thing that we have available, right? Because in the data, it was the case before. I guess the data is suggesting very highly that young people are dangerous, and the judges are choosing not to act on it. You already talked about that, right? But I'm just contrasting the magnitudes. The magnitudes are very, very different, which I'm kind of like surprised by the fact that I haven't heard this before, that judges are lenient. I mean, is that maybe something that's common sense and people already know about this? And see what I'm saying? That I think there's a lot of attention to the race piece, but it seems that this piece is very big and, to be understood further.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think this is one of a few big takeaways from this paper is that this age effect is huge. And I totally agree. It doesn't get much attention in the media. But it is like, it's a truly mechanical effect, right? I mean, age is one of the best predictors of risk. And basically, like, there have been a few studies that have shown that no matter, you can have a whole bunch of data available to you, but basically all the predictive power comes from criminal history and age. And if you know those two things, that's basically going to give you almost all of the predictive power, even if you could have had a lot more data. And so the fact that, what we're seeing here is essentially, the risk, implementing risk assessments is going to push us to lock more young people up, partly from this like political pressure of having this piece of paper saying the person's high risk, but it also means that, all the potential efficiency is coming from the risk assessment saying, hey, you're not locking all the young people up, you're doing it wrong, right? And if we're basically taking age off the table, so to speak, in terms of basically judges are like, oh, no, we don't care about that, right? We don't want to lock the young people up. Then essentially there's not a whole lot room left for the algorithm to improve decision-making, or the room is much smaller. And so I think both of those punchlines, that we're going to see an increase in incarceration for young people, and that these risk assessments actually probably won't have as much value as we think they will, if we're not willing to lock all the young people up, both of those things I think should be talked about more when we're discussing these in the public space.
And I'm somewhat glad that the political pressure has not, those judges not paying a price for that choice. If they're protecting young people, I guess it's nice that we haven't, at least I haven't heard a lot of political pressure like, oh, once the piece of paper is available, people can also complain, listen, they are not following the things in this particular way. And that's, again, not a piece of news that I remember being like very focused on.
In Virginia, judges are like the reappointment comes through the legislature, so they might be buffered a little bit. This might be something where we just haven't seen it yet. You know, you could imagine in states where judges are directly elected, you could imagine, and risk assessments are used more and more, you could imagine this being a source of political pressure in years ahead. So I do think it's something we should be potentially worried about. I don't think we're totally in the clear yet.
Great. Any other question? All right. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. It was a pleasure meeting you. I hope to see you at AUT at some point soon once this craziness ends.
I hope so too. Thank you so much, Carl.
All right. Have a good day.